Look closely at any royal portrait. You see divine bloodlines, rulers chosen by God, masters of wealth and power. But it was all a lie. Europe's strongest dynasty didn't fall from enemies, they destroyed themselves. Their pure bloodline produced a final king so deformed he couldn't close his mouth, chew food, or father an heir. Even his mother recoiled at his birth. Before Charles II of Spain became a medical impossibility, he was heir to the greatest empire on earth. Modern science later revealed the truth. He was more inbred than if his parents had been siblings. What follows is the tragic story of how the most powerful dynasty in the world turned its own blood into a nightmare. In the autumn of 1700, the mightiest throne in Europe was occupied by a monarch whose body was already failing beyond repair. Charles II of Spain, the final ruler of the Habsburg dynasty, spent his last months in a state so dreadful that even his closest attendants whispered that he was in the grip of demons. What unfolded during his decline etched itself into the memory of Europe as the great Habsburg line collapsed alongside the decaying body of its last heir. His death not only closed a dynasty that had reigned for centuries, but also hurled the continent into a brutal conflict that would transform the balance of power for generations. Yet, beyond these political upheavals, the true horror was in the spectacle of one man's body and mind slowly disintegrating, while his desperate courtiers resorted to ever more savage rituals to preserve both their king and their empire. This is the account of how centuries of royal inbreeding created a vessel of human misery, and how the agonizing end of one man redirected the path of world history. The medical notes and testimonies from those present at Charles's bedside form a portrait so disturbing that later historians struggled to communicate the sheer scale of his torment. What follows is not only a record of a king's death, but also an enduring lesson about the catastrophic results of absolute rule, corrupted by genetic collapse. For more than 2 centuries, the Spanish Habsburgs had commanded one of the largest empires on earth, stretching from the Americas to the Philippines. But by the end of the 17th century, cracks were becoming visible both in the Spanish dominion and within the ruling family itself. The dynasty had long practiced strategic intermarriage, convinced that it preserved dynastic strength and purity. Charles II, born in 1661, was the culmination of these generations of close unions. His parents, Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria, were uncle and niece. His grandparents had been first cousins, and his great-grandparents were bound by similar ties. The Habsburg family tree had become so entangled that Charles's genetic load was greater even than that of a child born from full siblings. The court had already recognized that their royal bloodline was producing ever more fragile heirs. Charles's older brother, Philip Prospero, died at just 4 years old, and numerous other children of the dynasty perished in infancy. Thus, from his first breath, Charles carried the crushing weight of the dynasty's survival, yet his body and mind bore all the marks of degeneration. He did not walk until the age of 8, spoke intelligibly only years later, and struggled with a host of deformities, including a protruding jaw, enlarged tongue, and frail limbs. His mental faculties were stunted, and seizures frequently racked his body. Still, in 1665, upon the death of his father, Charles was proclaimed king at only 4 years of age. His mother Mariana ruled as regent during his childhood, working tirelessly to project the illusion that her son could govern an empire. But Spain's weakness was no secret to its neighbors. Louis XIV of France had been steadily extending his reach, while the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I sought to hold the balance of power. Both rulers traced legitimate claims to the Spanish throne through Habsburg ancestry, and both watched eagerly for the inevitable, Charles's death without an heir. The matter of succession was the most pressing issue in Europe. Charles married twice in desperate attempts to secure an heir. His first wife, Marie-Louise of Orléans, died suddenly in 1689, her death rumoured to be poison after her failure to conceive. His second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, fared no better. Charles's own failing health made it nearly impossible for him to father children. By 1700, the king's decline accelerated rapidly, and the court fell into a state of anxious despair. Rival nations prepared for the looming crisis, while Charles's attendants experimented with increasingly bizarre and extreme remedies in the hope of salvaging either his body or the dynasty. That autumn, his deterioration became unmistakable. The physicians of Madrid observed that Charles could scarcely walk without being supported. His legs, thin and feeble, buckled beneath his wasted body. The infamous Habsburg jaw, already grotesquely distorted, protruded so severely that he could not close his mouth, leaving him constantly drooling and his words garbled beyond recognition. Eating had become nearly impossible. Food spilled from his mouth and swallowing was an ordeal. Observers described his appearance as horrifying, a pallid, deathly white face with bulging eyes that seemed too large for their sockets. His skin, waxen and translucent, clung to bone, and his hair fell out in ragged tufts, leaving bald patches that gave him the look of an old man though he was not yet 40. His mind declined in step with his body. He often sat in silence for hours, staring at nothing, before erupting in wild laughter or anguished screams. Servants swore he held conversations with empty air and insisted that shadows stalked him through the palace. Digestive collapse tormented him. Charles endured unrelenting diarrhea, humiliating himself during solemn ceremonies before foreign dignitaries. Even thin broth or watered wine rarely stayed in his stomach. Within hours, he vomited up whatever little nourishment he had managed to consume. Guards reported that night after night, his screams echoed through the royal chambers, and they would find him trembling in terror, babbling about demons clawing at his soul. He sometimes endured days without meaningful rest, the insomnia deepening his derangement. A revolting odor clung to him. Courtiers masked themselves with perfumes before approaching. Witnesses described a sickly sweet stench, as though of decay itself. His breath was so vile that even those closest to him gagged when he spoke. Worst of all were the seizures, violent, convulsive fits that left him writhing, foaming at the mouth, his eyes rolling back in their sockets. After each attack, he seemed diminished, as though some final fragment of his humanity was slipping away. The royal physicians were powerless. They had attempted bloodletting, purges, and herbal remedies, but nothing slowed the steady collapse of their monarch. Out of answers, they began to suspect his illness could not be explained by natural causes. By late 1700, whispers spread through the court. Charles was not merely sick, he was possessed. The Spanish Inquisition still held sway, and the decision to exorcise a king required solemn deliberation. Witnesses testified to his strange behaviors, his babbling in unknown voices, his fits of unnatural strength, his visions. Father Antonio Macabre, the court's chief exorcist, examined Charles and declared that the signs of possession were undeniable. He claimed the king spoke in tongues, displayed knowledge he could not possibly have had, and demonstrated powers beyond his frail body. The order was given: exorcism must begin at once. The first ritual was conducted in November, in the privacy of Charles's chamber. Bound to his bed, he writhed as Father Macabre intoned the ancient Latin prayers. Those present recoiled as the king shrieked in multiple voices, some childlike, others guttural, bestial. Soon the sessions became public theatre, with nobles invited to witness the battle for their monarch's soul. Charles strapped to his bed, convulsed as holy water was splashed and incense clouds thickened the air. He tore at his restraints until his wrists bled, bit his tongue until his mouth filled with blood, and raged for hours in Spanish, Latin and unearthly tongues. Each ritual left him battered and unconscious, his skin blistered from repeated anointings. Yet the court convinced itself these torments worked, pointing to fleeting intervals when he spoke with brief clarity, mistaking them for signs of victory over demons. Word spread swiftly through Europe. France's ambassador mocked the spectacle as madness. Protestant states seized upon it as proof of Catholic superstition and Spain's decline. For Spain itself, these exorcisms symbolized not only the king's torment but the empire's desperate attempt to hold on to a fading past. Among the foreign envoys who witnessed the nightmare was the Marquis de Louville, an unofficial French observer stationed at Madrid. His private reports to Versailles, later uncovered in French archives, described the king's misery with chilling precision. His Catholic Majesty presents such a pitiable sight, he wrote, that even his enemies could not help but feel compassion. Louville described Charles speaking with difficulty, his jaw hanging slack in a perpetual grimace, words mangled beyond understanding. He compared the exorcism scenes to torture chambers, noting how the monarch's cries reverberated through the palace, terrifying servants into frantic prayers. After these sessions, Charles often lay as motionless as a corpse, his breathing shallow, so weak that witnesses thought him already dead. The king's chief physician, Dr. Miguel Fernandez, kept clinical notes that revealed the magnitude of Charles's decline. By October 1700, he wrote, "The patient's digestion has ceased to function. He cannot retain solid food, and his bowels discharge continuously. His limbs are so enfeebled that he must be lifted like a child. His mind seems to dim each day." Fernandez grew openly frustrated with the reliance on exorcisms. "These rituals exhaust him terribly," he warned, "and whatever clarity they briefly inspire is soon undone by the physical trauma. We hasten death rather than delay it." His protests, however, went unheeded. The court clung to superstition, choosing priests over physicians. Charles's second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, gave perhaps the most intimate portrait of his torment. In letters to her sister in Germany, she described nights of terror beside her husband. "He wakes screaming, convinced demons tear at his limbs," she confessed. She begged for separate chambers, unable to endure the stench of decay rising from his body. Her writings reveal a woman pushed to the edge of madness, burdened by expectations she could never fulfill. Courtiers pressed her to extract a statement of succession, or to effect a miracle where doctors had failed. They look to me, she wrote bitterly, for salvation. Yet I can scarcely bear to remain in his presence. Servants too, though rarely literate, left oral testimonies recorded by foreign visitors. One chambermaid told the Venetian ambassador she had seen the king crawling like a beast through the palace corridors, clawing at the walls until his nails bled. Guards found him on his knees in the chapel, begging aloud for God to cure him or end his life. Nobles themselves admitted horror. The Duke of Alba confessed to a friend, to attend court now is to test the strongest faith. To see majesty so reduced is to question whether kings indeed rule by divine right. We pretend to serve a sovereign, yet in truth we only watch a drawn-out death. By late October 1700, it was obvious Charles was dying. He could no longer leave his bed, and his lucid intervals dwindled to rare minutes. His body wasted into a skeletal frame, skin stretched tightly over bone. Foreign powers no longer waited in secrecy. They began openly negotiating the partition of Spain's empire. At court, rival factions pressed him to name a successor. The Austrian candidate was Archduke Charles, while France put forward Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV. Both had fervent supporters at Madrid. In his few moments of clarity, Charles was forced to sign documents that he scarcely understood. Too weak to hold a pen, his hand was guided by scribes. The resulting marks were illegible scrawls, sparking later disputes over their validity. Meanwhile, the priests increased the intensity of their exorcisms. Father Macabre and his assistants virtually never left the royal bedchamber, repeating shortened rituals whenever the king stirred. His responses had grown faint, but the priests claimed this showed the demons were retreating. Physicians had effectively been dismissed. Dr. Fernandez no longer attended the king. Those doctors who remained were told to restrict themselves to easing discomfort. Yet even pain relief was discouraged, as priests insisted Charles's agony was essential to purging evil. Maria Anna, unable to endure the grotesque spectacle, withdrew from her husband's bedside. She devoted herself to frantic correspondence with Vienna, seeking to protect her own position should the Austrian claim succeed. Her letters reveal a woman unraveling, racked with guilt for abandoning her husband, yet terrified of watching him perish. The atmosphere within the Alcazar resembled a vigil for the dead. Daily routines halted, servants whispered in corridors, and foreign ambassadors wrote daily updates to their governments. All waited for news of the king's demise, knowing it would ignite the greatest political upheaval of the age. Charles's last conscious act was to receive the sacrament of extreme unction. The ceremony was performed with all the pomp Spain demanded, though he appeared scarcely aware of it. His whispered replies were nearly inaudible, and he lacked the strength to cross himself without help. On November 1, 1700, All Saints' Day, the king's final dawn broke. The palace chroniclers spoke of an uncanny stillness. After months of shrieking and convulsions, Charles lay eerily quiet. His shallow breaths barely stirred his chest. To some, this calm seemed a sign of success, that the exorcisms had at last freed him. Father Macabre remained at his side, chanting softly, touching relics to his forehead. Charles's lips moved faintly, as though in silent prayer, though none could decipher his words. The chamber was thick with incense, the Latin chants of priests echoing. Outside, nobles clustered, half in mourning, half in anticipation. Many whispered that death would be a mercy. Shortly before midday, Charles opened his eyes one final time. Witnesses claimed he seemed to recognize a few faces, tried to speak, but only incoherent sounds escaped before his gaze rolled back. This fleeting moment of awareness was his last. Hours passed in suspense. At last, around 2:30 in the afternoon, his fragile breathing ceased. Doctors hesitated, fearing a false death like those he had experienced before. After several minutes, they declared him gone. The end came without drama, a quiet departure after months of horrors. Protocol dictated that his body remain untouched for an hour before examination. Priests performed final prayers, declaring the demons expelled at last. Courtiers, however, wasted no time. Factions immediately maneuvered for control of the succession. Though secrecy was intended, word of his passing leaked by evening. Messengers sped across Europe carrying the tidings that would ignite the War of the Spanish Succession. Maria Anna, who had not been present at his bedside, was formally informed. Her reaction, accounts claim, was relief more than grief. Composure quickly returned as she assumed her ceremonial role, though her political future was deeply uncertain. 2 days later, on November 3rd, Charles's corpse was opened for autopsy by Dr. Fernandez and Dr. Antonio Yinga. Their findings, preserved in the royal archives, revealed a body so ravaged that the report horrified even seasoned historians. They found his heart small, blackened and shriveled, like a dried leather pouch, incapable of sustaining life. "It is a miracle this organ worked at all," Fernandez remarked. The lungs were sodden with fluid, riddled with abscesses. Half had rotted away, explaining his lifelong difficulty breathing and speaking. More shocking still was the brain, undersized, malformed, pocked with cysts and hemorrhages. The doctors concluded it was scarcely adequate for rational thought. His stomach was ulcerated, producing almost no acid, and his intestines blocked and inflamed. His liver was enlarged and hardened, likely damaged by years of medicinal toxins. His skeleton bore deformities throughout: crooked spine, twisted ribs, grotesquely protruding jaw. His bones resembled those of a man twice his age, brittle and frail. Most dreadful of all, however, was their discovery of organs already decomposing inside his living body. His tissues showed decay normally seen only after death. This explained the foul odor that clung to him for months. The doctors ended their report with words that would echo through history. "It is a marvel this body sustained life for 39 years. His suffering must have been greater than could ever be imagined. Death has delivered him from torments no man should endure." At first the autopsy findings were concealed, the court fearing that such grotesque revelations might permanently tarnish the monarchy. Yet copies inevitably spread across Europe. In Paris, Vienna, and London, the report was interpreted as evidence of the Habsburgs' degeneration. Propagandists seized upon the details of his shriveled organs and malformed bones to portray Spain as a decaying giant whose fall was inevitable. Charles's death instantly unleashed the greatest crisis Europe had seen since the 30 Years' War. The two strongest candidates, Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV, and Archduke Charles of Austria, both claimed the throne through Habsburg blood. In his final days, Charles had supposedly signed a will favouring Philip, but Austrian envoys contested its legitimacy. They insisted the king had been mentally incompetent, perhaps even under demonic influence, when persuaded to sign. Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, wasted no time in proclaiming his son the rightful successor. The ambiguity of Charles's mind in his last weeks provided ammunition for every side. Years of erratic behaviour, seizures, and supposed possession made his decisions suspect. Thus competing powers rushed to stake their claims not only with legal arguments but with armies. France quickly moved to defend Philip's rights, while Austria, supported by England and the Dutch Republic, rallied to Archduke Charles. Both Protestant allies dreaded a Franco-Spanish union, which they feared would create an unstoppable Catholic colossus dominating the continent. Reports of the exorcisms proved particularly damaging. To Protestant eyes, the idea of priests chanting over a convulsing king confirmed all their worst views of Catholic superstition. Pamphlets circulated mocking Spain's backwardness, portraying the monarchy as a theatre of absurd rituals rather than rational governance. Meanwhile, inside Spain, loyalties fractured. Many nobles leaned toward France, hoping Louis XIV's might would shield Spanish territories from partition. Others clung to Austria, believing only another Habsburg could preserve Spain's independence and honour. Yet all sensed the crown's weakness. As the news of Charles's death spread, Portugal, Italian provinces, and various colonial governors began to act independently, severing ties or switching allegiance. The once mighty empire was fragmenting. Economic panic struck at once. Colonial trade ground to a halt, as merchants hesitated to act until the succession was resolved. Spanish bonds collapsed on European markets, plunging major banks into crisis. By spring of 1701, diplomacy had given way to war. The War of the Spanish Succession would rage for more than a decade, stretching across Europe, the Americas and the seas, claiming millions of lives. The death of one man, crippled, infertile and broken by inbreeding, had set the world aflame. The Spanish Habsburgs, who had presided over an empire where the sun never set, ended not with a ruler of grandeur but with a figure barely able to function as a human being. Historians and modern geneticists alike have pored over Charles's case as a stark example of dynastic obsession turned catastrophic. Studies of the Habsburg pedigree reveal that Charles's inbreeding coefficient was equivalent to a child born of parents who were full siblings. Generation after generation of uncle, niece and cousin marriages had collapsed the gene pool until the dynasty's last scion embodied its ruin. The consequences reached far beyond Spain. Charles's death marked a turning point in European politics. No longer could dynastic claims alone dictate the future of nations. Military might, economic resources and emerging national identities increasingly determined power. The bizarre spectacle of Charles's final months, especially the public exorcisms, became a symbol of an old order stumbling into irrelevance. For Enlightenment thinkers, the case of Spain in 1700 illustrated the urgent need to replace superstition with reason. Medical historians remain fascinated by Charles's autopsy. It stands as one of the earliest detailed pathological reports, inadvertently documenting the effects of extreme inbreeding centuries before genetics could explain them. The account of organs decaying inside a living body has haunted physicians ever since. His life illustrates the biological limits even monarchs cannot transcend. Royal blood could not exempt him from nature's laws. Yet while politics and science draw lessons from his death, the human reality of Charles's suffering must not be overlooked. From birth he endured a life of deformity, humiliation and endless pain. All efforts to preserve the dynasty came at his expense. His marriages were arranged not for companionship but for breeding potential he could not fulfill. His courtiers, rather than offering comfort in his last months, subjected him to brutal rituals and turned his torment into theatre. His story reveals the cruelty of power structures that valued appearance of legitimacy over compassion. Charles was treated less as a person than as a political tool, kept alive in misery to preserve dynastic continuity. Even in death, his body was used as propaganda, his autopsy brandished by enemies as proof of Spain's decline. For philosophers of the Enlightenment, Charles became a warning. Voltaire and others pointed to Spain's demon-haunted king as evidence of what happens when monarchy degenerates into superstition and decay. Rational governance, they argued, must replace dogma and hereditary entitlement. At the same time, Catholic apologists recast him differently. Some framed his suffering as a kind of martyrdom, endured in defense of the faith. Competing interpretations proliferated. Degenerate monarch, victim of superstition, saintly sufferer. Each faction used his memory to serve its own agenda. But beneath the layers of politics and ideology, one truth remains. Charles II was a man born into privilege, yet condemned to a life of torment by the very lineage meant to glorify him. His final months, defined by grotesque illness, paranoia and exorcism, represent suffering at its most raw and universal. He reminds us that absolute power does not shield one from the human condition. The war that followed his death reshaped Europe permanently. Britain emerged as the leading naval power. France asserted continental dominance for a generation, and Spain began its long decline. Global conflicts fought across Europe and colonial theatres alike became the new normal. The death of a broken king set the stage for modern geopolitics. The story of Charles II's death is more than the conclusion of one man's life. It marked the collapse of a dynasty that had ruled vast lands across Europe, the Americas, Asia and Africa. For over 2 centuries, the Habsburgs had proclaimed their dominion eternal, yet their obsession with keeping power pure through repeated intermarriage created their undoing. The final heir, meant to embody their might, instead exposed the biological catastrophe at the heart of their legacy. Modern genetics confirms what contemporaries only sensed. Charles's genome bore the marks of centuries of contraction. His inbreeding coefficient equaled that of a child born from parents who were full siblings. The dynasty's determination to preserve its alliances through blood rather than through diversity guaranteed that its last king would be frail, infertile and doomed. Yet the importance of his death stretched far beyond medicine. It reshaped the political landscape of Europe and the wider world. His passing triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, which raged for over a decade, redrew borders and shifted the balance of global power. Britain emerged as the leading naval force, France tightened its continental grip under Louis XIV, and Spain entered its long decline. The war also revealed a new kind of conflict, truly global in scope, with battles fought not only in Europe, but also in North America, the Caribbean, and colonial territories. Charles's life and death became emblematic of the changing intellectual climate. To Enlightenment writers, the public exorcisms and the court's descent into superstition were stark examples of monarchy's decay. Philosophers pointed to Madrid's rituals as proof that rational thought, science and new political structures had to replace hereditary rule and medieval dogma. Spain's king, writhing in supposed possession, was transformed into a cautionary tale of what happens when absolute power clings to outdated beliefs. But others framed him differently. Catholic voices sometimes presented Charles as a figure of religious endurance, his lifelong torment cast as a test of faith. Within Spain, some chroniclers sought to soften his legacy, emphasizing his devotion to religion even as his empire crumbled. Competing narratives ensured that Charles became more symbol than man. Yet beneath these interpretations lies the tragic reality of his existence. From infancy, Charles endured disabilities that left him vulnerable, mocked and manipulated. His life was never truly his own. His body was the battleground for dynastic ambition. Every remedy forced upon him, from marriage to brutal exorcisms, was meant to serve the dynasty rather than his person. Even his death was politicized. His autopsy used as a weapon in the propaganda wars of Europe. This stripping away of humanity is perhaps the darkest legacy of his story. His suffering was not hidden but displayed, ritualized in ceremonies, reported by envoys, and dissected by historians. Instead of allowing him dignity in his final months, the court turned his torment into theatre, hoping to salvage legitimacy from misery. The lessons of Charles II's decline resonate still. His case demonstrates the biological danger of manipulating human reproduction for political goals. The Habsburgs' obsessive inbreeding, intended to consolidate dynastic strength, produced instead a monarch so disabled that he could not preserve their empire. His autopsy remains a warning carved into history. Genetic diversity is not an abstract principle but a requirement for survival. Equally, the political aftermath reveals the fragility of power. One man's inability to produce an heir destabilized a continent and cost countless lives. Dynasties, no matter how mighty, can collapse not only from external wars but from the frailties of their own bloodline. Charles's death reminds us that history often turns on the vulnerabilities of individuals. The spectacle of his final months also challenges our assumptions about civilization and progress. The Spanish court was in theory among the most sophisticated in Europe, adorned with art, wealth and learning. Yet when faced with their king's decline, they reverted to medieval exorcisms, bloodletting and ritual, exposing how quickly fear can strip away reason. It shows how societies under threat cling not to science but to superstition, even at the expense of compassion. And in the end, Charles's story is also profoundly human. Beyond the dynastic struggles, beyond the philosophical lessons, was a man trapped in endless pain. His short life was marked by deformity, humiliation, and dread. He endured seizures, madness, and a body that decayed while still alive. He screamed through nights, begged for death, and was bound to his bed as priests tormented him further. This is what makes his legacy haunting, that even surrounded by the splendor of empire, his existence was misery, that a king who commanded half the world's lands could not command his own body, that the very bloodline meant to glorify him was the chain that destroyed him. For historians, doctors, and philosophers, Charles II remains a prism through which to study power, genetics, and human suffering. For us, he remains a warning that unchecked ambition, superstition, and arrogance can lead to catastrophe, not only for rulers but for nations. His death was the death of a dynasty, but also a lesson echoing across centuries, that power without humanity becomes its own curse. The Habsburg line in Spain ended with Charles II, but the shadow of his suffering lived on. His name became shorthand for the perils of inbreeding, the decline of Spain, and the grotesque absurdity of power. His final days, whispered about in horror and fascination, became symbols for both enemies and successors. Some saw in him divine punishment, others a victim of history's cruelties, but all agreed his story could not be forgotten. In the end, the terrifying last months of Charles II of Spain stand as both historical record and moral parable. They remind us that rulers, however exalted, are mortal, that dynastic ambition cannot outwit biology, that superstition cannot heal suffering, and that compassion must never be abandoned in the face of politics. His life closed an era, his death began a new one, and his agony still speaks to us centuries later.